So we have been discussing about this micro propulsion mechanism. So especially we have been talking about this bio-inspired micro robots, about the different microscale propulsion mechanism, the need for the microscale propulsion mechanism. In this propulsion mechanism, we have been discussing about this bacterial inspired flagellum based micro propulsion mechanism and a ciliary based propulsion mechanism. And then we have discussed about some of the key parameters which are involved with reference to these bacterial inspired flagellum propulsion. In fact, we have discussed in detail about the different configurations which are involved in this bacterial inspired flagella, and what are the different dimensional parameters which are involved, the magnetic actuations which are involved, the overall swimming velocity, and the directional controls. So we have discussed in detail about some of the key outcomes of these systems, what all the different fabrication steps which are involved in these systems, and then we have also derived some of the parameters which are involved with reference to force perspective point of view, with reference to magnetic propulsion perspective point of view, with reference to actuation perspective point of view in detail. Now let us discuss about the other propulsion strategies in micro robots. So as far as in this propulsion strategies are concerned, so we can classify these propulsion strategies in micro robots into four. One is called as a nematode inspired undularity swimming motion, this one, so which is a kind of a propulsion based system. Okay, and then we have the water strided inspired surface tension manipulator. We have the kind of living cell integration based biohybrid propulsion, and the other one we call it as a light driven propulsion. In fact, so we have two modules on this bio-inspired, where we will be discussing in detail about these kind of propulsion mechanisms, how these propulsion mechanisms are deployed for different applications. Now, as far as these nematode inspired undulatory swimming is concerned, so these mimics the movement of the worm. It has a small aquatic organism that uses a kind of a wave-like body motions. So it can be achieved using a kind of a soft actuator that deform and responds to stimuli like light or electric field. So some of these nematode inspired undulator swimming is like actuators are concerned. So electroactive polymers are efficiently used for such kind of nematode inspired structures. Now, when we try to talk about the next one, which is a kind of a water strider inspired surface tension, so like it takes an advantage of the interfacial force to move efficiently on the liquid surface. So in the earlier case, it's a kind of a small aquatic, like if you see a kind of a small micro worm which tries to move in a stored water or in a stagnant water. So such kind of nematode, such kind of propulsions are inspired, which we call it as a nematode type system. Whereas a water strider is something like it tries to stick on to the water and it tries to float on the water, so that appropriately we can see the forces which are being generated, and these robot that alters the surface tension gradient, which uses the temperature or the chemical release. So ideally these are effectively used actuate based on the surface tension gradient as well as the temperature. Now when we try to talk about the living cell integration based biohybrid propulsions, these are almost, it mimics the kind of a living cell such as muscle cells or a sperm cell or bacteria as an actuator. Like there are different examples, like one is a kind of a bacterial driven micro robot which is effectively used for a kind of a targeted drug delivery. So like it almost mimics the kind of a microorganism. It almost has a structure similar to a muscle cell or a sperm cell, and it can move in a particular direction. Okay, in fact, in this particular module, we will be discussing about this algae based propulsion. So where we will be discussing more about this. Okay, then we have the light driven propulsion system. So as far as these light driven propulsion system are concerned, it uses a light responsive material to generate movement in a kind of a micro scale robot. So some of the examples of these light driven propulsion systems are concerned. One is called as a soft micro robot, that bend or contract and when exposed to a specific light wavelength. So when a light falls on it, appropriately it bends or contract, and you can have a kind of an actuation which exhibits over here. Now when we closely observe the locomotion in the liquids, so these locomotion in the liquid are also known as this aquatic locomotion or swimming locomotion. So if we closely observe the movement of organism through this liquid medium, it can be achieved by swimming or by moving in contact with the bottom or other surfaces. So some of the examples of this aquatic motion, so basically includes this fish, arthropod, mollusks, amphibians, reptiles, birds and mammals are some of the examples of this aquatic locomotion which is used for the kind of a movement. So if we closely observe the overall mechanism, how it works, so here let us take an example of a cilia and a flagella. So they have a kind of a simplest propulsion system for a kind of an aquatic locomotion. When we look into the undulatory swimming perspective point of view, this involves wave-like bending of the body that travels down the body axis. When we try to look into the active drag perspective point of view, when swimming or paddling is concerned, the limb or tool that generates the propulsion, it also creates a drag, and then it is used for it is effectively used for initiating such kind of micro propulsion system. Now as far as in this particular case is concerned, so if we look into the overall fundamentals which are involved for locomotion in liquid at a small scale, so we can consider these Reynolds numbers or the stroke flow. So these Reynolds number, ideally they are like represented as RE, which is a kind of a dimensionless parameter that determines whether a flow is dominated by inertia or viscosity. So here if we try to look into the key parameters which are involved, so we have a rho which is nothing but the density, V is the velocity, L is the characteristics length, and micro is the viscosity, which like takes care of the Reynolds number. In fact, regarding this we have discussed in the first module also. So for micro robotics, these Reynolds numbers, it is always expected it should be less than 1, which means the inertia is negligible and it is compared to the viscous force. Most important, the flow is linear and time reversible, and it has a meaning with a kind of a reciprocal motion and which do not generate a kind of a net displacement. Movement perspective point of view, the movement must follow a non-reciprocal strategies which we call it as a kind of a scallop theorem. Now let us discuss about in detail about the locomotion of such kind of micro robots, especially in the kind of a liquid environment. So the first locomotion what we are going to discuss is called as a flagellar propulsion, which is a kind of an helical swimmer. So these flagellar propulsion or the helical swimmers are basically inspired by a bacterial flagella. This method uses a kind of a rotating helical filament for a propulsion perspective point of view. The key principle which is involved, it has a bacteria such as E. coli which uses a rotary motor to spin a helical flagella which create a kind of a screw-like motion through the fluid. So these micro robots mimic this mechanism by using a kind of an artificial magnetic flagella that rotates under the external magnetic field. Some of the examples of such kind of systems basically includes this helical magnetic micro robot or soft artificial flagella. So if we look into the propulsion mechanism perspective point of view, or if you look into the overall key systems perspective point of view, there is a flagellum in place. Then there is a kind of a passive part of motion which is available, and then we have a kind of a propeller mechanism. So these propeller mechanism motion rotates and it creates a kind of a swimming motion for a kind of a bacterial flagellum. In fact, in the last class we had discussed that we could the overall frequency which is generated from the structure is close to around 100 Hz, which is capable enough for generating an appropriate swimming behavior. Now let us discuss about the cilia based propulsion mechanism. As far as cilia based propulsion mechanism is concerned, it is called as ciliary beating. So it is inspired by the paramecium, which uses a kind of a coordinated beating of a tiny hair-like cilia. In fact, in the last module also we have seen, so we have seen a structure something like that with a kind of a hair. This hair is used for an appropriate propulsion or an appropriate actuation for the forward movement. So when we try to look into the principal perspective point of view, these cilia move in an asymmetric, and it is a kind of a time irreversible pattern. A power stroke pushes the fluid, which generating a thrust, and a recovery stroke brings the cilium back to its initial position with a minimal resistance. So this motion breaks the time and the reversibility. It always enables the propulsion in this particular system. So there are different examples are there. One is called as a magnetically actuated cilia, and the other one is called as a electrically driven cilia. So the magnetically actuated cilia, either in the case of a magnetically actuated cilia or in the case of a electrically driven cilia, there is going to be a propulsion which exhibits, which takes care of the back and forth beating. Now let us see the next level propulsion, which is called as a magnetic field driven propulsion. So as far as in this magnetic field driven propulsion is concerned, it utilizes an external magnetic field to manipulate a micro robot embedded with a magnetic nanoparticle. So when we try to look into the principal perspective point of view, it has a kind of a rotating magnetic field which causes a screw kind of motion in the helical robot, and an oscillating field drive the cilia like beating or a kind of an undulatory movement. With reference to gradient perspective point of view, in magnetic field it creates a pulling force which enabling the direction of the motion. So some of the examples of these helical magnetic swimmers or the magnetic steered micro robots, ideally it looks something like this, where there will be a kind of a soft headed structure. So these helical robots, like it has a kind of a spring kind of structure. When the spring rotates, so appropriately we can expect a kind of a linear displacement. So that is what we call it as a kind of a corkscrew based system, where a kind of a rotary actuation is appropriately converted in the form of a linear form. Now let us discuss about the flexible or the kind of an undulatory swimming. So as far as these flexible or undulatory swimming perspective point of view, it is inspired by the eel-like or a kind of a spermatozoa based locomotion, where the traveling waves, it is along the body creates thrust. So when we try to look into the principal perspective point of view, a flexible filament or a soft body which propagates to an undulatory waves along its length, and this motion interacts with the surrounding fluid and it generates a kind of a forward motion. So ideally, like in this particular case, we have a micro device in place and a microorganism in place, and there are some examples like electroactive based swimmers and the thermally actuated based swimmers are some of the key like propulsion system which are being effectively used for creating such kind of flexible or an undulatory swimming. Now when we closely observe the application perspective point of view, these application of these robotic liquid motion is concerned. So it is effectively used for some kind of biomedical related application. Some of the biomedical related application ideally includes this targeted drug delivery, where it has a kind of a magnetically guided robot that can carry a drug to a precise location, and it can be used for a kind of a minimal invasive surgery. So these micro robots can navigate through the blood vessels, or it can be used for some kind of microsurgery perspective point of view. So like if you look into the propulsion, so either it might be a kind of a microorganism, something like this, or it is a kind of a helical micro robot, something like that. Either we can, especially for a targeted drug delivery, these drugs can be encapsulated at this particular point, so that the locomotions are exhibited, that is especially the propulsions are like exhibited in such a way that it reaches a particular point and then it will try to issue the drug. So for those locomotions, such kind of structures are being effectively used. Next is with reference to minimal invasive surgery perspective point of view. See, these micro robots can navigate through a kind of a blood vessel, or it can also perform a kind of a microsurgery. Now, when we try to look into the environmental monitoring, it is highly used for detecting pollutants and contaminants in water. It is also used for exploring confined or hazardous liquid environments, are some of the key key aspects with respect to environmental monitoring perspective point of view. So when we try to look into the lab on chip perspective point of view, these kind of manipulation microfluidic flows are for diagnostics as well as chemical analysis. It is being effectively used. Now, if we try to make a comparison with reference to these bio-inspired mechanism which is used in the locomotion, so the most working window is something like less than 1 mm, and like it doesn't means like it has a traditional means of movement, or it has a kind of an additional interdisciplinary field which will be helpful for a appropriate locomotion. So in certain cases it might be through magnetic, in certain cases it might be through pressure, in certain cases it might be through an effective fluid flow. So the inertia which is generated is negligible, and here the almost a kind of a viscosity dominate. So when we try to closely observe the movement, this movement must overcome a high resistance, especially in liquids. So these kind of bio-inspired mechanisms are heavily characterized for a kind of a low Reynolds number environment. So that is what we had discussed in the earlier slide also, where Re is less than 1. So in this section, so we have the following bio-inspired mechanism which are used in the locomotion. So one is a kind of a bacterial flagella, the other one is a kind of a sperm flagella, and this is a kind of a cilia based structure. So in the case of a bacterial flagella, so the bacteria is a kind of a living organism that can move inside the low Reynolds number under a fluidic environment. Since it has a kind of a helical shaped filament which is called as a flagellum, it is used by the bacteria for an appropriate locomotion. So these bacteria have one or many flagella which is located at the pole or the lateral side of the cell body. So in fact this is a kind of a classification, so where we can classify it with reference to the number of flagella and with reference to the placement of the flagella. So when we try to look into this bacteria like E. coli, which uses a kind of a flagella to swim effectively at low Reynolds number, which is considered to be one of the critical parameter, their movement mechanics involves rotating a helical filament via a rotary motor. It is also powered by a kind of a proton motive force, or sometimes a kind of a sodium ion gradients. In fact, these kind of proton motive force or kind of sodium ion gradients are a kind of a chemically stable structure. So these chemically stable structures heavily participate into the structure to create a kind of a locomotion. So in this particular case, we have a different rotation directions which control running, which involves forward, which involves tumbling, which is nothing kind of a random orientation which is being generated from these structures. Now let us discuss about the different classification of the bacteria according to the placement of the flagella structure. So if we closely observe the type, we have a monotrichous type structure. So in the case of a monotrichous type structure, so it is considered to be a one flagella, where there is a placement of the flagella which is nothing but one pole, and the overall layout looks something like this, where we have one pole which is being placed over here. Now we have the other type which we call it as peritrichous based structure. So in this peritrichous based structure is concerned, we have two or more types of flagella. So the placement of the flagella is lateral. So here we have, if you see the construction or configuration of it, so there are two or more flagellas which are being present in this. There is a third type which we call it as amphitrichous type of flagella structure. So it has a two flagella. Basically it has two poles which is kept over here, and then and it can be used for a appropriate rotary movement as well as an appropriate like a linear movement can be generated using this. Then we have the locotrichous based structure, which is a kind of it has more than two, as far as flagella perspective point of view, it has more than two flagella, and the placement of the flagella is concerned, it has one pole, and the overall layer looks something like this, where we have a structure, and these structure are effectively used for the locomotion. So these are some of the classifications of the bacteria according to the placement of the flagella. Now, as we have seen, like these microrobots that mimic these monotrichous bacteria can be classified as microrobot with head and without head. So these microrobots having both head and tail are fabricated using a magnetic material which improves the magnetic effect. So because of the nature of the helical structure, these magnetic robot can swim inside these fibrous environment, which lead to a kind of an in vivo experiment. So if we try to classify this helical microrobot, so we can have a kind of a soft magnetic head, which is we can classify the structure based on the type of the magnetic head. So one is called as a soft magnetic head, which has a kind of a flexible structure. Then there is a small micro holder in place. So the main function of the micro holder is to take care of the flexible movement, and then there is a kind of a spherical head. So ideally, even though the locomotion is taken care by this helical micro robot, however, direction perspective point of view, these directions are well oriented with reference to such kind of soft structures which are being employed. So that's how we have a soft magnetic head, we have a small micro holders, and then we have a kind of a spherical holders which takes care of the locomotion. Now, if we look into the application perspective point of view, as far as application in real world micro robotics is concerned, it is used for biomedical application, ideally for a targeted drug delivery, where micro robots swim through the blood or tissue to reach the cancer cell. It is heavily used for minimal invasive surgery since it has a capability to navigate inside the human body for diagnostics, or it can be used for kind of a micro intervention perspective point of view. Biofilm disruption perspective point of view, these micro robots, they destroy these harmful bacterial colonies. So for those applications, such kind of structures can be deployed. Now when we look into the environmental perspective point of view, this is highly used for a kind of a pollutant reduction and a chemical and a cleanup. These flagella inspired swimmers, they carry a sensor or a cleaning agent, so that it can be used for a kind of a pollutant reduction and it can be used for cleanup of the structure. Now when we try to look into the water quality monitoring, so these has a kind of an autonomous navigation which is in the kind of a confined environment, and it is like in this confined environment it can move in an appropriate fashion to collect these structures. When we try to look into the advantageous perspective point of view, these flagella based micro robots, it is a kind of an efficient swimming even in the viscous environment. It has a high maneuverability and it has a good direction control. It has a kind of an energy efficient propulsion with a minimal mechanical complexity, which is considered to be one of the key aspects. And with respect to scalable perspective point of view, it is scalable to a nano or a micro level. Now let us discuss about this sperm flagella. So as far as these sperm flagellas are concerned, it almost mimics the kind of an animal sperm, which are motile main reproducive cell. These motile sperms have a beating tail like flagellum to propel through the fluids. So these human sperm cell beat at a frequency of 10 to 30 Hz, which varies depend upon the environmental condition. However, these human sperm also having a swim velocity of around 50 microsecond and a beat amplitude of around 5 micrometer and a beat wavelength of around 12 micrometer. So the shape and the propulsive performance of these tail dependent on it basically depends upon the viscous force. So like this is a kind of an equation which are being deployed, like with reference to sperm number perspective point of view. Basically it's kind of a biological relation. So from the biological relation, so appropriately a kind of a mechanical relation is being derived. So with reference to like biological relation perspective point of view, the different parameters which are involved are L, which takes care of the length. Then we have the transverse, we have a viscous drag, and then we have an angular frequency, which are being participating towards the driving action and the bending stiffness of the flexible tail. So these can be used to describe the kind of a relative magnitude of these forces. Now when we try to look into the transverse viscous drag perspective point of view, so we have the contributing dynamic viscosity which is being participating over here. we have a tail diameter which is being participating over here, and then there are certain constants which are being taken care into these particular systems. As far as application perspective point of view, they are highly used for kind of reproductive medicines, like which is used in assisted fertilization, especially in the case of male infertility, and guiding sperms towards the egg in the vitro. And most important cases, it is highly used for a kind of a targeted drug delivery. So these micro robots mimics a sperm to swim to a specific tissues where a tumor or a uterus are there, and then it is used for a targeted system. So ideally, it is especially useful for a localized delivery in a narrow as well as a fluid filled environment. Advantages perspective point of view. So when we try to look into the key features, so it has a wave-like motion, so which benefits a smooth propulsion in a viscous media. It has a soft, flexible body which is safe for interaction with living tissues. It is highly biocompatible, so it is suitable for a kind of a vivo application. With respect to directional control, it has a good directional control which is achievable via an external fields. And feature perspective point of view, it is highly efficient, and it is mimicked as one of the nature's most optimized framework. So these are some of the characteristics which have been taken up and which are engineered for micro robotic development. Okay, so in the next lecture we will discuss about the cilia type propulsion in detail.